Hello friends, in today's video we would like to talk about reform and rebellion. This is a reading from Shekhar Bandhopadhya from Plassey to Partition book. This is part of Delhi University's syllabus and under the heading called Reformism and Anti-Reformism in the 19th Century. So in the previous video we had talked about that how East India Company began its rule in India. So in the beginning actually East India Company restricted itself to only trade and later it tried to acquire political power, but it did not intervene. So in the beginning it followed a non-interventionist policy. This was the policy that the East India Company followed in its initial decades of rule. This policy was based upon pragmatism that required a respect for traditional Indian culture. It was termed as a policy of Orientalism and it was pursued by Warren Hastings. Then Bandhopadhya in this reading talks about the school called Orientalism. So objectives of Orientalist school or the kind of ideology they had or they pursued here in India was like this. They had this intellectual curiosity to learn about Indian culture through scriptures. They wanted to use the knowledge in matters of governance. They had a liking for the culture and they had also a liking to understand India's literary traditions. This led to establishment of Asiatic Society in 1784, Calcutta Madrasa in 1780 and Sanskrit College at Banaras in 1791. Let's talk about quest for control. So Orientalists school they argued that knowledge about the subject population, their social customs, their manners and codes were regarded as a necessary prerequisites for developing permanent institutions of rule. In order to develop permanent institutions of rule, Orientalists argued that they had to acquire knowledge about the India's subject population and their social cultures and traditions. Warren Hastings' policy to govern the conquered in their own ways and resist Anglicization thus reflected Orientalist ideological preferences and also political pragmatism. Let's talk about paradigm shift 1785 onwards. So in the beginning the East India Company followed a non-interventionist policy, but here onwards East India Company started following a cautious or judicious intervention in the Indian social institutions. So since the end of Hastings' tenure, there was a gradual move towards cautious intervention in Indian social institutions. What factors did contribute to this shift? So, due to several ideological influences in Britain, such as evangelicalism, utilitarianism, and free trade thinking, these were some of the factors which inspired this paradigm shift. So, while the utilitarians began to talk of appropriate social engineering and authoritarian reformism, the evangelists argued about the necessity of government intervention to liberate Indians from their religions that were full of superstitions, idolatry, and tyranny of the priests. The free trade thinkers too wanted government intervention to free Indian economy from the shackles of tradition to ensure a free flow of trade, but the company's government was still tentative about interfering for fear of adverse Indian reaction. It could not do so unless a section of the Indian society was prepared to support reform. The first crop of Western educated intelligentsia, such a group that would support wide ranging social reforms in India, was soon to emerge through the introduction of English education, which became therefore the first and the most important area of intervention and innovation for the company's state in India. Let's talk about English education as a tool adopted by the British to intervene. English education was introduced in India in the 18th century through the charity schools run in Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay for the education of European and Anglo Indian children. The company supported these schools in various ways but did not take any direct responsibility for the education of the indigenous population until 1813. Apart from running a printery and translating the Bible into local languages, they also ran schools for both boys and girls. Unless they directly offended the religious sensibilities of the local population, the company's government tolerated such missionary activities, the number of which before 1813 was, however, very small. So here now begins actual commencement of Western education. The real beginning of Western education in India began with the Charter Act of 1813, which not only allowed the missionaries to travel to India but provided for the allocation of 100,000 rupees per year for two specific purposes. First, the encouragement of the learned natives of India and the revival of and improvement of literature. Secondly, the promotion of a knowledge of the sciences amongst the inhabitants of that country. This was unprecedented in an age when publicly funded education was not in vogue even in England. The immediate concern of the British Parliament in forcing the company into this commitment was once again the corruption and degeneracy of its officials in India, but beyond that, there was also an agenda for greater territorial control. The officials rampantly exploited the country as they viewed it as a temporary territorial possession, argued Charles Grant. So, greater commitment to the development of the natives would provide a greater sense of security, or in other words, a sense of duty to the people would lead to the development of a context for greater consolidation of power. So, greater commitment to the development of the natives would provide a greater sense of security, or in other words, a sense of duty to the people would lead to the development of a context for greater consolidation of power. But this decision did not immediately decide the nature of education to be provided for the Indians. Which education is to be promoted, indigenous or modern Western education? In official thinking in India, the Orientalist thoughts were still powerful and they wanted an advancement of Indian classical literature and the sciences of the land. The program they chalked out was for the establishment of a Sanskrit college in Calcutta, two more Oriental colleges at Agra and Delhi, and patronage for the Tolls and madrasas as institutions of indigenous learning. Tilt in favor of English medium schools. In opposition to Orientalists, a new school of thought was also there. Public attention in India was steadily being drawn away from this tradition of indigenous classical learning. Christian missionaries and European individuals like David Hare started opening schools in all parts of India where English became the medium of instruction, and then the Calcutta School Book Society and later Calcutta School Society, started in 1819, began to promote vernacular schools for elementary education. From now onwards, we will start the arrival of Raja Ram Mohan Roy and the way he advocated for English education, because remember, East India Company wanted to create a crop of Western educated Indian intelligentsia, which could be a support for the British Empire to actually introduce reforms in India. Remember, we talked about the non-interventionist policy of the East India Company, but after the Warren Hastings period was over, it was decided that we will be initiating judicious or cautious intervention in India's social traditions. And this is how it all began. So the journey of reforms began this way. Initially, the East India Company was quite reluctant. It did not want to interfere. It did not want to hurt people's sentiments about social reforms or social traditions. then it began intervening very judiciously, very carefully, did not want to hurt the sensibilities of the Indian population. And then came a period when it was able to create a western educated class in India, which could actually demand for reforms, which could actually ask for reforms themselves for their fellow Indians. Thank you very much.